The greatest empires in human history rarely collapse because an external enemy breaches their walls. They collapse because ultimate victory breaks their internal logic. In June of 323 BC, Alexander the Great lay dead in the sweltering heat of Babylon. His conquests had systematically eradicated every single rival worthy of the name. From the rugged Balkans to the Indus River, the entire known world had been folded into a single political space. But this monumental success created a terrifying new reality, because there were no external enemies left to fight. The only remaining battlefield was the empire itself. The paradox of 323 BC is as cruel as it is inevitable. The world had been unified by unprecedented military speed, but enduring unity requires durable rules, and the empire had been built infinitely faster than its laws. To understand the catastrophe that followed, one must first dismantle the illusion of the Macedonian miracle. In the final years of Alexander's reign, his project looked like divine destiny. A marginal kingdom from the northern, mountainous edge of the Greek world had surged across the Hellespont and, in a single generation, violently converted massive Persian imperial space into Macedonian imperial ambition. But conquest at a continental scale creates a radically new kind of political problem. Administration, taxation, and legitimacy must now travel farther than any previous Greek political imagination could comprehend. The older Greek city-state model, the polis, had assumed that politics could comfortably fit inside a ring of defensive walls. Alexander's empire assumed that politics could fit inside supply roads, royal couriers, isolated military garrisons, and captured treasuries. The empire did not merely need to win pitched battles. It needed to persist and govern in the vast, silent spaces between them. That persistence depended on a highly experimental hybrid machine, a machine that was absolutely brilliant for aggressive expansion, but entirely brittle for succession. Traditional Macedonian kingship was deeply personal, unapologetically military, and entirely charismatic. Its authority was not based on abstract constitutional law. It was a living, breathing relationship between the supreme commander and his aristocratic companions, between the warrior king and his veteran infantry, sealed by shared blood, shared risk, and the shared plunder of fallen cities. Persian imperial infrastructure, by stark contrast, was deeply bureaucratic, hierarchical, and rigidly ritualized. It relied on vast administrative zones called satrapies to organize geographical space. It relied on tribute systems to systematically convert agricultural land into centralized revenue. It relied on elaborate court ceremonies to convert raw, naked power into ideological obedience. Alexander, with characteristic audacity, attempted to weld these two fundamentally opposing logics together. The resulting synthesis could project force and move resources faster than either the Macedonian or Persian system could alone. But it also inherited the lethal weaknesses of both paradigms. The personal, charismatic kingship of the Macedonians could not survive a vacuum of personality. It required a living god of war to function. Simultaneously, the vast imperial bureaucracy of the Persians could not independently choose a Macedonian king. It only knew how to obey the one who sat on the throne. This was the missing constitution at the dark heart of Alexander's project. There was no binding legal mechanism for choosing a successor. There was no stable, civilian bureaucracy that could operate independently of the sovereign's direct command. There was no durable, universally accepted legal principle that could command the loyalty of the armed forces when the king was absent, incapacitated, or dead. The Macedonian war machine had been rigorously trained to follow a brilliant commander, not a piece of parchment. The elite officer corps had been trained to fiercely compete for physical proximity to the king, not to politely submit to parliamentary procedure. Even before Alexander's final breath, the pressure points of state failure were highly visible to anyone willing to look. The veteran soldiers were profoundly exhausted, and military exhaustion is not merely a physical condition. It is a highly volatile political condition, because tired soldiers negotiate their loyalty far differently than hungry, ambitious conquerors do. The traditional Macedonian elites were deeply anxious about their status. Alexander's royal court had deliberately become cosmopolitan, integrating Persian nobility and elevating new sycophants, which inherently threatened the older, blood-based hierarchy of the Macedonian Old Guard. Meanwhile, the vast local populations across the sprawling empire silently watched the conquerors, coldly calculating whether continued obedience was safer than open rebellion. Furthermore, the captured treasuries of Susa and Persepolis were immensely tempting. In a militarized society, gold is not just wealth. It is leverage. Gold is the universal language that pays mercenary armies, buys political time, and funds assassinations. Distant frontiers, such as Bactria and India, required continuous, heavy military attention, which meant that ambitious generals were always operating with temporary autonomy. But a fundamental law of geopolitics dictates that autonomy in a conqueror's empire is never temporary. It hardens into habit, and habit quickly metastasizes into a sovereign claim. Here lay the central, inescapable paradox of 323 BC. Alexander's overwhelming success permanently removed rivals abroad, ensuring that all military conflict would inevitably turn inward. As long as there were Persian armies to crush, uncharted mountain ranges to cross, and foreign kings to overthrow, the Macedonian coalition remained tightly fused together by sheer, forward momentum. But when no external enemy remained on the map, the coalition that had conquered the world began to ask the oldest, most dangerous political questions in human history. Who gets paid? Who gets honored? And who commands? A massive, highly tuned war machine that lacks an external enemy will inevitably turn into a political machine hunting for internal purpose. The succession crisis that exploded in Babylon immediately following Alexander's death is too often treated by historians as a tragic family drama, a soap opera that shrinks grand history into petty palace rumor. But this was not gossip. This was a catastrophic, strategic bargaining collapse at the highest level of human power. In any absolute monarchy, the designated successor serves as a focal point. They are a single, universally recognized name that efficiently coordinates the obedience of millions. When that focal point is suddenly erased, every ambitious political actor is mathematically forced to assume the absolute worst. They must assume that their fiercest rivals will capture the machinery of legitimacy and immediately use it to destroy them. Therefore, extreme caution morphs into extreme aggression. In succession crises, explosive violence is almost always a form of preemptive self-defense wearing the respectable mask of loyalty. The surviving claimants to Alexander's throne were not leaders. They were entirely hollow symbols. Philip III, known as Aridaeus, technically existed. He was an adult half-brother of Alexander, but he was severely compromised by cognitive incapacity. This made him incredibly useful as a puppet, and therefore incredibly dangerous to anyone who didn't control his strings. On the other hand, Alexander IV did not yet exist. The Bactrian queen Roxana was heavily pregnant, and her unborn child offered the theoretical promise of perfect, untainted legitimacy, combined with the perfect, total weakness of an infant. The political reality in Babylon was brutal. The army desperately needed a banner to rally behind before it could even begin to choose a coherent policy. A recognized king's name was the only mechanism that could unify payrolls, administrative appointments, and military command. Without that name, the empire's rigid chain of obedience instantly dissolved into a chaotic, violent chain of bargaining. This desperate bargaining revealed a hidden, foundational fracture inside the Macedonian state. There were, in fact, two entirely distinct political cultures living within one army. First, there was the traditional infantry assembly. These were the hardened, scarred phalangites who believed that the army, acting as a democratic collective, possessed the ancient, absolute right to acclaim kings and pass judgment on commanders. Opposing them was the companion cavalry elite. These were the aristocratic officers, the brilliant tacticians, and the wealthy nobles who firmly believed that imperial power rightly belonged to those with superior bloodlines, vast estates, and direct access to the inner sanctums of the royal household. Each faction possessed a deep, existential terror of the other's monopoly over legitimacy. Therefore, inside the suffocating walls of Babylon, every single proposal regarding the succession was simultaneously a proposal about which military faction would economically and politically dominate the empire's future. When political identity is violently divided inside the armed forces, every bureaucratic decision becomes a matter of life and death. From the chaos of the council, a man named Perdiccas emerged as the supreme regent. On paper, it was a highly rational, mathematically sound choice. Perdiccas possessed physical proximity to Alexander during his final hours. He commanded immense authority within the elite cavalry structure. Most importantly, he possessed the crucial physical symbol of the royal signet ring, which Alexander had handed to him, an object that Perdiccas immediately interpreted as a divine designation of authority. The strategic logic of the regency was straightforward: heavily centralize the empire, control the bureaucratic center through the royal household, and monopolize the apparatus of high command. But a fatal, irreconcilable contradiction sat at the very core of that logic. To govern the sprawling empire, the regent was required to command men who each individually held fiercely loyal armies and governed massive, wealthy provinces. Therefore, the office of the regency was not a comfortable throne. It was a glaring spotlight. It instantly revealed the one man who would systematically need to offend, diminish, and threaten every other general in order to rule them. The infamous partition of Babylon in 323 BC was a desperate, panicked attempt to convert political chaos back into administrative order. It assigned the vast satrapies of the empire like entries on a grand accountant's clay tablet. It mathematically distributed commands, territorial borders, and financial responsibilities. To the untrained eye, it looked exactly like governance. But it was not governance. It was merely an armed ceasefire written in administrative ink. Crucial satrapies were awarded to warlords who were not, in any reality, subordinate to the center. These men now legally possessed local taxation networks, vast provincial treasuries, access to regional veteran networks, and the overwhelming strategic ability to delay orders, negotiate terms, or openly defy the regent. Therefore, the partition did not solve the succession crisis in the slightest. It merely postponed the violence by granting each ambitious general the necessary time and legal cover to deeply entrench his own power. Almost overnight, strategic geography became destiny. The specific lands these generals claimed dictated the exact nature of the wars to come. Ptolemy claimed Egypt, a brilliant choice because Egypt was a natural, impregnable fortress of wealth. It offered limitless grain, easily defensible borders surrounded by brutal deserts, and unfettered access to the vital sea lanes. Antipater and Craterus held Macedonia, which mattered deeply because it was the sole recruitment base for elite phalangites and the sacred cradle of Argead dynastic memory. Whoever held Macedonia could always claim to be the real, authentic heir to the homeland. Antigonus claimed Phrygia in Asia Minor, a region that contained vast treasuries, massive manpower reserves, and crucial crossroads, but also geographical distances so vast that centralized command naturally fractured. The Mediterranean sea lanes mattered immensely because absolute maritime control was the only thing that separated a mere regional ruler from a true imperial contender. In this dark, post-Alexandrian world, sprawling fleets of warships and fortified deep-water ports rapidly became as decisive as the heavy infantry phalanxes. Almost immediately, the terrifying weakness of the new imperial structure was signaled by open revolt in Greece, an explosion known as the Lamian War of 323 to 322 BC. The Greek city-states, spearheaded by Athens, had long been violently contained by their sheer terror of Macedonian retribution. Hearing of Alexander's demise, they instantly sensed a brief, golden window of vulnerability. But the true historical meaning of the Lamian War runs far deeper than its eventual military outcome. It explicitly revealed that Alexander's empire was not a shared, ideological identity. The conquered peoples felt no patriotism toward Babylon or Pella. The empire was only a shared, collective fear of Alexander's standing army. Therefore, the empire was less a unified nation than a highly temporary alignment of incentives held together exclusively by the terrifying reputation of one man. Remove the man, and all global incentives immediately rearrange. Then came the ultimate pivot, the moment when the administrative fiction of imperial unity finally detonated into naked, open competition. Alexander's death did not begin one single, unified contest. It mathematically triggered three simultaneous, interlocking wars. Who held the legitimate royal name? Who held the physical loyalty of the veteran army? And who held the vital treasury routes that paid that army? These were not separate administrative questions. They were a single, unforgiving equation of state power. Legitimacy without military force is just theatrical pageantry. Force without regular pay is guaranteed mutiny. And pay without political legitimacy is nothing more than glorified banditry. Therefore, the grand struggle of the Diadochi became a ruthless, bloody search for the one specific combination of these three elements that could actually endure. The first grand collision was the war of legitimacy versus force. The Babylonian settlement had cowardly crowned two flawed kings. the disabled Philip III and the infant Alexander IV, while empowering Perdiccas as regent. It looked like a brilliant compromise, but in reality, it created a perverse structure where every single warlord could loudly claim to be entirely loyal to the kings, while simultaneously preparing for total war. The kings were reduced to living symbols. The regent was reduced to a frustrated administrator, and the heavily armed generals were the only true reality. Therefore, the high-minded language of imperial unity became nothing more than political camouflage. Each faction loudly declared its undying devotion to the sacred royal house while frantically building private mercenary armies and hoarding private gold reserves. The second grand collision was Perdiccas versus the increasingly independent satraps. To actually govern the empire as he envisioned, Perdiccas needed to violently discipline the very men whose military strength made them absolutely indispensable. Ptolemy in Egypt, Antipater in Europe, Antigonus in Asia Minor. Each of these men commanded hardened veterans who had literally marched to the edges of the known world. These commanders firmly believed that their unparalleled victories entitled them to far more than mere subservience to a former equal. Perdiccas faced the classic, unsolvable problem of imperial centralization. The royal center desperately needs exceptionally strong agents to project its power across vast distances, but strong agents invariably become dangerous rivals. Therefore, the regent could not tolerate their independence, yet he lacked the overwhelming asymmetric force required to easily destroy it. Among these formidable rivals, it was Ptolemy who revealed the sharpest, most modern strategic instinct. Ptolemy possessed the profound understanding that political legitimacy is not merely decreed by law, it is actively, visually staged for the masses. In one of the most brilliant maneuvers in geopolitical history, the physical corpse of Alexander the Great was transformed into a weapon of mass psychological destruction. The grand funeral procession, an unimaginably lavish golden catafalque designed to carry the conqueror back to Macedonia, was not mere ceremony. It was the ultimate imperial signal. Whoever hosted the conqueror's monumental tomb could eternally present their specific territory as the empire's true sacred center, the one undeniable place where divine memory and earthly authority converged. Through bribery, military interception, and sheer audacity, Ptolemy hijacked the massive funeral train in Syria and forcefully rerouted it to his stronghold in Egypt. Therefore, Egypt gained far more than a rotting corpse. It gained a magnetic beacon for elite loyalty, a sacred shrine for displaced veterans, and an unparalleled propaganda engine that loudly declared to the entire world, the future of the empire resides here. This single, audacious act viciously exposed the utter fragility of Perdiccas' centralized regency. The logic was devastatingly simple. If a rogue satrap could casually steal the dead king's body and suffer no immediate consequences, what else could be stolen? If the ultimate symbols of state could be captured, then the regent's authority, already a highly delicate, theoretical construction, would be permanently exposed as entirely hollow. Therefore, Perdiccas had no strategic choice. He chose maximum escalation. The regent's massive gamble was to mobilize the Grand Army and personally march against Egypt, to reassert absolute central authority through the decisive, brutal punishment of Ptolemy. A highly successful campaign would definitively prove that the center still commanded the periphery. It would serve as a bloody warning to Antigonus and Antipater that defiance carried the ultimate cost. But the invasion of Egypt carried its own lethal poison. Total failure would instantly reveal that royal titles meant absolutely nothing when veteran armies simply refused to bleed for them. The imperial campaign against Egypt failed, and it did not fail merely for tactical reasons. Egypt's harsh geography heavily favored the defender. Its massive agricultural resources easily bought the time needed to outlast a siege. More importantly, Ptolemy's brilliant political positioning relentlessly weakened Perdiccas from the inside out. The Macedonian soldiers marching in Perdiccas' grand army were being asked to suffer and die for an abstract idea, the philosophical idea of imperial unity. Meanwhile, their rival Ptolemy stood on the opposite bank of the Nile, offering them a far simpler, far more attractive bargain. Physical safety, massive silver payouts, and proximity to stable, unshakable wealth. In protracted civil conflicts, the loyalty of an army inevitably shifts from the abstract office of the state to the immediate requirements of their own survival. During a disastrous attempt to force a crossing of the Nile, where thousands of Macedonians were swept away or devoured by crocodiles, the psychological breaking point was reached. Therefore, Perdiccas discovered the ultimate limit of his regency. No royal decree, no matter how beautifully written, can compel the devotion of men when the army fundamentally believes that the war itself is against their own financial and physical interests. Then came the most chilling, instructive moment of the entire era: assassination deployed as a form of administrative governance. In 321 BC, inside his own command tent, Perdiccas was brutally murdered by his own senior officers, led by men like Seleucus and Pethan. This was not just a chaotic military coup. It was a definitive, historical verdict on the empire's entire political design. The lesson delivered that night was immediate, stark, and brutal. Titles are fragile. Legal decrees are worthless. Economic networks and personal patronage are durable. And above all, a standing mercenary army is simply a political electorate armed with 20-foot spears. Therefore, the violent death of the regent did not somehow magically restore unity to the Macedonian world. It definitively confirmed that unity could never be restored by any of the methods currently available. The Grand Empire of Alexander had officially ceased to be a state. It had become a hyper-violent marketplace of armed coalitions. After 321 BC, the United Empire did not truly continue. It violently fragmented into highly competitive, predatory successor states that still deceitfully spoke the high language of unity while ruthlessly practicing the strategy of total division. The Diadochi, the famous successor generals, did not immediately declare themselves kings. For years, they refrained from wearing the diadem because the ancient Argead royal house still carried enormous, superstitious symbolic power among the rank-and-file veterans. But historical symbolism is a commodity that can be rented. A weak king could be aggressively protected, carefully guided, or tragically avenged, all while being entirely used as a disposable political instrument by a strongman. Therefore, royal legitimacy fundamentally changed its nature. It was no longer a moral constraint upon ambitious men. It became merely another weapon in the arsenal of those who controlled the actual armies. The endless wars of the Diadochi, raging from 323 to 281 BC, formed not a single coherent conflict, but a complex, self-sustaining geopolitical system. It was an era defined by constantly shifting coalitions, rapid, breathtaking betrayals, and cold, mathematical recalculation. In this new world, alliances were absolutely never moral commitments. They were highly temporary, pragmatic solutions to immediate military threats. One rival's overwhelming strength today mathematically became another rival's existential danger tomorrow. If Antigonus grew too powerful in Asia, Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Cassander would instantly ally to break him, only to turn their swords on each other the moment he was defeated. Therefore, diplomacy turned into war by other means, and war turned into diplomacy by other means. Every single military campaign reshaped the global bargaining positions, and every single peace negotiation merely set the exact tactical conditions for the inevitable next campaign. Slowly, over decades of bloodshed, violence itself became highly administrative. The temporary satrapies irreversibly hardened into permanent, sovereign kingdoms. The looted treasuries of antiquity became highly structured payroll engines designed to sustain standing armies of hundreds of thousands of men. Royal marriage alliances became the ultimate treaties, desperately attempting to bind rival families together in the exact ways that geographical borders could not. Hostage-taking became a standard feature of high diplomacy, simply because actual trust was incredibly scarce and human collateral was entirely measurable. We must understand that this era was not a mere degeneration into mindless chaos. It was the active, painful construction of a completely new political order through the only reliable instrument available to them: carefully controlled, massive military force. Therefore, actual governance in the brutal successor world often meant the precise, daily management of the elites through a calibrated mixture of absolute fear, massive financial reward, and breathtaking theatrical spectacle. The decisive, macro-historical result of this half-century of carnage was the creation of a completely new geopolitical reality: the Hellenistic world. This world was dominated by massive successor monarchies: Ptolemaic Egypt, the sprawling Seleucid Empire in Asia, and Antigonid Macedonia, with dozens of lesser powers precariously orbiting them. Each of these powerful new states was violently born from the exact same imperial toolbox. They all utilized the old Persian satrapal administration. They all relied on massive military settlements to maintain control over native populations. They all deliberately planted Greek civic institutions, gymnasiums, and theaters among older indigenous cultures. And they all constantly, obsessively invoked the sacred memory of Alexander to justify their right to rule. But because they all shared this identical DNA, each state constantly competed for the exact same pool of imperial prestige. Therefore, Alexander's grand empire ultimately survived not as a unified political entity, but as a brand, a potent, immortal idea that could be endlessly claimed, endlessly imitated, and endlessly weaponized by absolute monarchs. The single human constant pulsing beneath this massive geopolitical transformation was not cartoonish villainy, but highly predictable, rational ambition, massively amplified by total institutional absence. Personal ambition is never an anomaly in human history. It is the default, baseline setting of humanity whenever legal institutions lack the physical power to enforce restraint. The terrifying collapse of Alexander's empire explicitly exposes a permanent, iron rule of power. When the mechanisms of succession are unclear, every single former ally instantly becomes a legitimate claimant, and every single piece of the inheritance instantly becomes a bloody battlefield. Therefore, the most dangerous moment for any empire, state, or corporation is rarely the moment of foreign invasion. The true apex of danger is the moment of internal transition. Here, the deeper, more profound strategic tragedy fully emerges. Alexander's unprecedented military expansion created geopolitical complexity infinitely faster than his administrative coordination could ever mature. The empire violently stretched across dozens of languages, ancient religions, distinct economic zones, and local elite networks that did not, and could not, naturally harmonize. Alexander's overwhelming personal authority functioned as the sole narrow bridge connecting these vastly different worlds. But personal authority is not hereditary in the same way that physical territory is hereditary. A son can inherit a throne, but he cannot automatically inherit the psychological awe that his father commanded. Therefore, the empire's sheer, unfathomable scale, which was hailed as its absolute greatest triumph, became the very mathematical reason it could not possibly be governed by the traditional, intimate Macedonian model. The victory had outgrown the constitution. This is precisely why the Diadochi era must never be dismissed as merely a violent, confusing epilogue to the romantic tale of Alexander. It is one of history's most vital political laboratories. It explicitly demonstrates how grand coalitions behave when the unifying external threat permanently disappears. It reveals exactly how professional armies bargain when financial pay and legal legitimacy finally diverge. And it shows how physical symbols, like a stolen corpse or a royal signet ring, can be as strategically decisive as the mass charge of a heavy cavalry squadron. The hijacked body of the conqueror, the cowardly double-king compromise of Babylon, the Regent's doomed, bloody enforcement campaign on the Nile. Each of these events perfectly reveals the hidden mechanics of civil war. These wars were not the result of sudden, irrational madness. They were a perfectly rational, highly predictable cascade of mutual insecurity. Therefore, the wars of the successors should be read closely by anyone interested in power, as pure strategic logic made entirely visible. The central, unyielding thesis of this era is stark. Alexander conquered a sprawling empire, but he completely failed to institutionalize a state. Vast conquest can be executed through sheer genius, extreme violence, and unprecedented speed. But enduring governance requires repeatable, boring, predictable rules that can successfully survive the reigns of perfectly ordinary, unexceptional men. When the extraordinary man inevitably dies, the state faces a binary choice. It either immediately becomes law, or it immediately becomes prey. The final verdict on the Macedonian century, as the historical dust eventually settles over the Mediterranean, is measured entirely in long-term outcomes and devastating human costs. The fabled unity of Alexander's realm died the very second his heart stopped beating, despite every desperate, loud proclamation by his generals that it would endure forever. The ancient royal house of Macedon, the bloodline of Philip and Alexander, was systematically exterminated, reduced to a set of political tokens passed between heavily armed patrons until the tokens were no longer useful, and the children were quietly murdered in the dark. The successors built massively powerful, technologically advanced states, but every single one of these states was violently born in blood and maintained only by a state of perpetual, exhausting readiness for war. Therefore, the ultimate price of the Great Macedonian Miracle was more than a century of profound global instability that permanently remapped the geopolitics of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. Yet, the final story of the Diadochi is not purely one of destruction. The resulting Hellenistic kingdoms eventually became massive, humming engines of cultural and economic exchange. Greek language, art, and philosophy violently crashed into local Egyptian, Babylonian, and Persian traditions. Administrative techniques became highly advanced, military innovation soared, and brilliant ideas moved freely along the exact same logistical routes that the conquering armies had originally opened. But we must remember that this magnificent cultural flowering, the world of the Library of Alexandria, the Stoics, and the great scientists, was not the carefully planned gift of a peaceful, harmonious empire. It was the brutal, unintended byproduct of ruthless, cutthroat successor competition. Therefore, even the staggering brilliance of the Hellenistic era forever carries the dark shadow of its origin. It was a world made dynamic exclusively by its fragmentation, a world fundamentally energized by war, never pacified by unity. The reflection in the modern mirror is entirely unavoidable. Today, massive states, sweeping political movements, and sprawling corporate empires often fail not at their lowest moment of defeat, but at the very absolute apex of their maximal expansion. They collapse when their internal complexity finally outruns their capacity to coordinate, and when the comforting myth of ideological unity can no longer mask the brutal reality of competing, selfish incentives. Institutions that appear utterly solid and unshakable under the sheer gravity of a dominant, charismatic leader invariably reveal themselves as fragile, hollow shells the exact moment that leader leaves the stage. High-sounding titles, inspiring slogans, and formal bureaucratic hierarchies can easily persist on paper for decades, while the actual raw power quietly shifts to whoever physically controls the enforcement mechanisms. Power always flows to the men who control the money networks, the channels of communication, and the organized instruments of coercion. Therefore, the terrifying successor crisis of 323 BC is not merely ancient gossip to be debated by scholars. It is a permanent, recurring, and inescapable pattern in the architecture of human governance. The ultimate legacy question of Alexander's death remains, and it fiercely refuses any easy, comforting answers. When a society chooses to build its entire order around the sheer willpower of exceptional individuals, rather than undertaking the slow, painful work of building durable legal rules, does it truly create lasting greatness? Or does it merely borrow a temporary illusion of stability from a dark, violent future that must, eventually, pay the debt in blood?